I now like to welcome this evening's speaker, Tariq. Thank you.
If we look at what is going on today, it's astonishing that after all the hopes that were aroused in some, that with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of one enemy, the end of authoritarian rule in parts of Eastern Europe, the end of the dictatorships in South America, that there was some hope, there was talk even of a peace dividend, and in reality, what we have seen is wars, upheavals, religious intolerance, jihadi fundamentalism, continuous wars in parts of Africa, some of which aren't even discussed in polite society, like what's been going on in the Congo, where the figures of people killed in the civil war being waged by, sometimes you feel, corporations which have armies to get the wealth of that country. The figures have reached at least 4 to 5 million dead, if not more. And then we have a growing feeling that actually democracy and democratic institutions themselves are not functioning as they should, and in fact we are living in a sort of twilight period of democracy itself. So what I want to do this evening is try and explain how I see this. And I think a starting point has to be what happened in the 90s on a global scale, which was the implosion of the old Soviet Union, with the collapse of one power system and the creation of a whole vacuum all over the world, which had been filled by different things in different parts of the world, including, incidentally, religion. And not just Islam. But if you look at the statistics and figures of the growth of religion and the decline in agnosticism and even atheism in the Western world, the figures are quite dramatic. I mean, for some countries, they've always been there, but by and large, there's been an increase in religiosity and religious belief in the West as well, which is something we should not forget, because one of the countries where it's increased is France, which is currently being in the news. Combined with this process, we have seen the rise of something which has never been experienced in the history of humanity before. The emergence of a global empire, the United States, with enormous power and enormous strength and unchallengeable militarily, not politically, not economically, though it's difficult, but unchallengeable militarily. And this empire and the hegemony it has exercised in the world is now dominating global politics. I don't think there has been one before, and I don't think there will be one later. And so I think a great deal depends here in terms of what actually happens inside the United States itself, its population, its citizens, its numerous minorities, its politics. The actual political structure of the United States has not changed much for 100, 150 years. So it may be economically advanced, which it is, and even culturally so, as its soft power dominates the world, but its own political structures virtually remain unchanged. And this contradiction, I think, will have to come to a head sooner or later at some stage when the American population feels that it's time to do so, It may be influenced by events abroad, but how it will change will be from within. I say this because a huge debate takes place on the subject around the following issues. A, is the American empire in decline? And there is a huge literature of declinism in which people are producing books in different parts of the world saying that this decline is not only started, it's happened, and it is irreversible. I seriously regard this view as nonsensical. It's wishful thinking. I think that the American empire has had setbacks, but which empire doesn't? I mean, it had setbacks in the 60s, and 70s, and 80s, in different parts of the world. The defeat it suffered in Vietnam in 75, people thought was definitive at the time. It could never rise again. Not true. And it hasn't suffered a setback on that scale since that time. And I think at the present moment, despite its setbacks in different parts of the world, the United States remains a strong and dominant empire. Its soft power all over the world, including in the heartlands of its economic rivals, its hard power still quite dominant, enabling it to occupy countries, and its political, ideological power still very strong in, to mention one continent, Europe. If it has suffered setbacks on a semi-continental scale, they have been in South America. And interestingly enough, these setbacks have been political and ideological rather than economic. I mean, the chain of electoral victories for political parties and movements in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, partially in Brazil and elsewhere, have been extremely important for showing what? For showing that there is a different alternative possible within capitalism. There has been no frontal challenge to the capitalist system as such. And even today, when we come to Europe, the victory of Syriza in Greece, the rise of Podemos in Spain, two radical parties of the left, neither of these parties are posing a systemic challenge to the system. The challenge that they are posing is effectively one which in this country we could compare to the reforms pushed through by Clement Attlee as leader of the Labour Party in 1945. Virtually all the programmatic points implemented by the parties in South America are effectively left social democratic reforms. What Syriza is arguing for is the same. What Podemos in Spain is arguing for is the same. But social democratic reforms have become intolerable for the neoliberal economic system imposed by global capital on the world. And that's where the danger lies. Because if you begin to argue, as those in power do, if not explicitly, implicitly, that the only way forward is to have a political structure in which no challenge to the functioning of the system as it is today is permitted, then we are in dangerous times. Because that means that there are no political alternatives left within the confines of capitalism, and that can lead actually to forms of authoritarianism within the capitalist world today, which we witness even as we speak. The elevation of terrorism into a threat which is supposed to be the equivalent of the communist empire of old? Bizarre. The use of this word, bills being pushed through Parliament and the American Congress to stop people speaking to vet people who speak at universities, to say that outside speakers have to be asked what they're going to say before they're allowed into the country. I mean, these seem minor things, but they are actually emblematic of the age in which we live. And the ease with which all this is accepted sometimes is quite frightening. Because if citizens of these countries fail to rise in protest at these measures and punish the parties who carry them through, then we're going to be stuck for a long time. From that point of view, it appears that this century, the 21st century, is going to be a long century. It's not going to be a short one. If what we are being told is that all that is possible is what exists, then we're going to be in for some trouble. Because ultimately it won't be accepted. And if you prevent people from speaking or thinking or developing political alternatives, left social democratic alternatives, it's not just the ideas of Karl Marx which are threatened or attacked. That's more understandable from the point of view of capitalism. It's the ideas of Karl Polanyi, a major social democratic thinker, and an extremely intelligent one, which are also under attack and being challenged. And that is why we have seen developing on the political front of the neoliberal world order a form of government which I have described as the extreme center, which governs large tracts of Europe, and which includes the left, center right, center parties, all merged. When choices are offered at elections, nothing fundamental changes. So that a whole layer of young people in particular, but not just them, feel that voting makes no difference at all, given the political parties we have. And this extreme center wages wars either on its own accord or on behalf of the United States. It backs austerity measures. It defends surveillance as absolutely necessary to defeat terrorism, without ever asking why this terrorism is happening. To question this is almost to be a terrorist yourself. That Iraq, under an authoritarian dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and his predecessor, was a country with the highest level of education in the Middle East, with functioning universities, with Baghdad University in the 1980s, just to make this point, had more women professors than Princeton did in 2009. That there were nursery facilities so that women could come and teach at schools and universities. There was no democracy accepted. But in terms of the social level of the population, it was very high. In Baghdad, and particularly the city of Mosul, currently occupied by the Islamic State, you had libraries going back centuries. The Mosul library was functioning in the 8th century with manuscripts, ancient manuscripts from ancient Greece, apart from anything else, in its vaults. The Baghdad library, as we know, was looted after the occupation of that country without anyone preventing it. And we know perfectly well what is going on now to the libraries in Mosul under the Islamic State. So how did this happen automatically? It's a consequence of that disastrous war, which assumed genocidal proportions. The numbers of people who died in Iraq are disputed because the coalition of the willing, as it was called, don't count civilian casualties of the country they're occupying. Why should they bother? And so the figures we've worked out, or they've been worked out by Lancet and the Johns Hopkins Medical Department, are that up to 1 million Iraqis died in that occupation, mainly civilians. So the process we saw, the sanctions imposed on Iraq after the first Gulf War began to wreck its social infrastructure. The actual occupation of the country and the removal of the government is one of the most destructive acts, really, in modern history. Because even though Hiroshima and Nagasaki were nuked, the actual social and political structure of the Japanese state was maintained. Because while the Germans were defeated, the Italians were defeated in the Second World War, quite a lot of their military structures, intelligence structures, police structures, judicial structures were kept going because there was another enemy already in the offing, communism. But in the case of Iraq, they were treated like no other country had been treated. And people don't realize this because once the occupation happened, all the correspondents came back home, by and large, with the exception of a few. Largely, I mean, you can count them on the fingers of a hand in this country. Patrick Coburn, Bob Fisk, one or two others, and that's it. And that is also dangerous in terms of the information and knowledge provided to people as to what is actually happening to a country that they've occupied. And I think one reason that Blair is utterly loathed by large numbers of people now is because many supported him and then later saw through it and realized that they'd been lied to. And for that, he won't be forgiven. The same applies to leaders in Europe who did the same. The country's social infrastructure still is not working. Years after the occupation, it's been wrecked and destroyed. And that country will never be the same again. It's been de-modernized. That's what the West has done in Iraq. De-modernized the country. Destroyed its education services, destroyed its medical services, literally in many cases. Handed over power to a group of clerical Shia parties who immediately embarked on bloodbaths of revenge. 1,200 university professors were killed. 1,200. If this is not disorder, what is? I won't go on about Afghanistan because we now know. I mean, the whole world knows that this big attempt to go and, as the United States and the British leaders put it, to modernize the country. I mean, Sherry Blair and Laura Bush said we're actually going to save women. It's a war for women's liberation. If it had been, it would have been the first time in history, but never mind. We now know what it was. A crude war of revenge which has failed. Because the occupation actually strengthened those it had gone to destroy. And it's not only destroyed that country and what infrastructure it had, but it's destabilized a neighboring country, Pakistan, which has nuclear weapons, and which is now in a very dangerous state as well. So these two wars have not done any good to anyone, not even the Americans, who are very discredited as a result. But what they have done is to divide and break up the Muslim world, the Arab world. So the battles now are on who the big power backs in which conflicts. In Iraq, they back the Shia. And you know, this whole demonization of Iran is very unfair, because the reality is that without the support of the Iranians, tacit support of the Iranians, there is no way the Americans could have taken Iraq. And the resistance which began in Iraq against the occupation was getting somewhere when the Iranians told Muqtada al-Sadr and his group, which was participating with the Sunnis against the occupation, to call it off. He was taken to Tehran and given a holiday there for a year. So without the Iranian support, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, it would have been very difficult for the United States to occupy that country. And the thanks Iran got was sanctions being demonized, still further double standards being used. Israel can have nuclear weapons, you can't, which again creates a great deal of anger. So the Middle East is now in a total mess. The central, most important power is Israel, expanding away. The Palestinians have been defeated for a very long time to come, in my opinion. All the principal Arab countries wrecked. First Iraq, now Syria. Egypt, a brutal military dictatorship in power, torturing, killing just like before, as if the Arab Spring had never happened, and for the military leaders it hadn't. And at the same time, the balance shifts to these tiny little principalities. Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, where there was a rebellion, was crushed by the Saudis with the backing of the United States. And then there is, of course, Saudi Arabia. And these are the countries which are economically and politically taken very seriously by the West, as most of you have witnessed. I think this is the first time that flags flew at half-mast for the death of a Saudi monarch. And if things carry on going the way, it'll be the same when the Qatari sheikh dies too. And Bahrain. So it's a dangerous situation. So the breakup, the disintegration of the Middle East that was born after the First World War is carrying on. Whether Iraq will be divided into 3 countries, whether Syria will be divided into 2 or 3 countries, we don't know. But it wouldn't surprise me if it were. So it's not looking promising there. And all the hopes raised by the Arab Spring really went under. And I think it's important to understand why they went under. It's because many of them, of those who participated in these movements, did not see, for generational reasons largely, that in order to really hit home, you did have to have some form of political movement. So that when the Muslim Brotherhood, which had participated in the Egyptian movement at a later stage, took power, it was not surprising. They were the only political party that was active there. How could they not, is the question. The people who were hostile to them within the movement had no alternative. And so they suffered. And then the Muslim Brotherhood played straight into the hands of the military by behaving largely like Mubarak did, offering deals to the security services, saying carry on working for us like you did with Mubarak, offering deals to the Israelis, saying we'll be just like Mubarak was, and then people began to say, if you're going to be just like them, what the hell is the point of having you in power at all? And the military then behaved very cleverly in the way it mobilized some mass support and got rid of them. It hasn't solved anything, but it's demoralized an entire generation in the Middle East. Let's come closer to home now. Because if this is the situation in the Middle East, what is the situation in Europe? the United States is still very dominant on many levels, especially the military level. Britain, which became a semi-vassal state after the Second World War, now then under Thatcher, I mean, the last British Prime Minister to display some element of sovereignty, I mean, there were two. Wilson refused to dispatch British troops to Vietnam, and Edward Heath refused to allow British bases to be used to bomb the Middle East in the 70s. Apart from these two prime ministers, subsequently, it's been very clear. I mean, virtually complete vassal status. And not with the support even of large chunks, I would say, of the British establishment. There was a great deal of anger within the Foreign Office during the Iraq War, because they felt there was no need for Britain to be involved. And I recall this event with great pleasure. I was invited in 2003, and the war was going on, to give a lecture in Damascus in Syria. And I went to give this lecture, and before I left, I got a phone call from the British Embassy in Damascus saying, "Hello, I'm so-and-so, the secretary to the ambassador, and we know this is you'll consider this unusual, but he's very keen you come and have lunch with us when you're in Damascus." So I thought this was quite odd. I said, "Yes, fine, okay." And I arrived at lunch, was greeted by the ambassador, who said, "Just to reassure you, we won't just be eating, we'll be talking politics." And I said, "That is very reassuring." And he said, I've invited people from every single faction in Syria to the lunch." I said, "Better still." I said, "Including the government?" He said, "Yes, there'll be senior figures from the regime here." I said, "Okay." So he said, "It'll be answers and questions." I said, "It's a long time ago, which is why I'm revealing it now, because he's retired since." So he said, at the lunch, he said, "Now it's time for questions. I'll start off." So the guests looked at him and said, "Fine." And he said, "Tariq Ali, I read that piece you wrote in The Guardian 2-3 weeks ago, arguing that Tony Blair should be charged for war crimes in the International Criminal Court." I said, "Yes, this is accurate." He said, "Do you mind explaining to us why?" Well, I spent about 10 minutes explaining to him why, to the bemusement of the Syrians who didn't know what was going on in the British embassy. And so I said, I explained. And the ambassador said, "Any supplementaries?" They said, "No." And he said, "Well, I agree totally with that. I don't know about the rest of you." And so we went on with other questions and answers, none as pointed as this, but along similar lines. And after all the guests had left, I said, "Well, that was very courageous of you." And the MI6 guy who's at the lunch said, "Yeah, he can do that because he's retiring in December." But these guys are not fools, they knew exactly what they were doing. And it was the humiliation of having a government which, even though the Americans had said, "We can do it without you, if there's dissent at home," Bush said, "I'll understand, don't come." Insisted on going. And it was that, the sort of self-humiliation of a vassal state, that I think antagonized lots of members, certainly of the foreign policy, and I would say probably also of the defense establishment, who felt that Britain wasn't prepared for this at all.